Welcome to, by way of reminder, our weekly video podcast where we talk about things that we as elders believe are important discussions, conversations to have. For the last couple of weeks, we've been doing a series called Kingdom First, where we talk about what does it mean to put the kingdom first in the world today. How do we balance our citizenship in the heavenly kingdom with our citizenship in the country that we live in today? And we're going to be talking about some current events, some cultural issues. We started the first week talking about eternity. We wanted to put it in a big picture kind of perspective and provide ballast and root everything that happens, in this cultural moment or in the lives in which we live in very eternal perspectives, as the Bible would call us to do. Then last week we talked about
politics.
It
was impolite.
That's right. We talked about how the politics and religion, two things that aren't typically part of polite conversation, we covered them both last week. Certainly there was many more things that could be said, but we wanted to, lay down some foundational things, some general things about how to navigate politics within the Christian life. And that tonight, we're going one step further. We're going to be talking about worldviews and competing worldviews. And eventually tonight, we're going to get to one that's kind of a hot topic right now in 2021, February the 3rd. For those that might be watching this 6 months, a year, 2 years from now, if it should last that long. We're going to be talking about some issues related to critical theory. And then, Lord willing, next episode will be on critical race theory, more specifically. And then the episode after that, our plan is to discuss how gender issues play into critical theory and how we as Christians are to navigate those things that are going on. So, to dial it back again to tonight. Tonight we're talking about worldviews. Christian worldviews specifically is where we're going to start. How would you guys define, start with worldview, and then we'll get more precise on Christian worldview. What is a worldview?
I mean, I think simply it's kind of a lens or a filter through which you see things. It's kind of your perspective on things.
Yeah, I would say it's an overall view on how you view the world and like the truths about the world, and so and in which we operate. And I would say that a worldview informs us on what you believe. On how we act. It shapes our decision makings. So it's kind of an all-encompassing view of how you view the world.
It's kind of a grid. It's the assumptions, the presuppositions with which you interact with the world. It's impossible to interact with the world without some interpretive grid to process what's important, what's unimportant, what matters, what doesn't matter. How do you talk in terms of right and wrong? If you use those terms, and do those terms have any meaning? All of that has to do with one's worldview. That's just generically worldview.
And it's some of those big questions that worldview seeks to answer, right? Like, where did I come from? What is the meaning of life? As you said, how do I know right from wrong? How do we try to solve problems in the world? What's the solution to what's wrong with the world? Is there something wrong with the world? I suppose as Christians we would assert that there is something wrong with the world, and we'll get into our Christian worldview, which is a good place to go next.
Yeah, I mean, I would also, just to add on what you say, like your worldview determines how you view politics, for example, potentially the role of government. It can impact even down on how you serve and treat your neighbor. So
small things too, big things, and also very small things are affected by it.
Yeah, worldview is at least an element of worldview is ethics.
Yes.
And those kinds of interrelationships. It's more than that, but it's certainly not less than the ethics of how you function in the world with others around you.
You'd said everybody has a worldview. I think it's interesting thought that you can't really not, somebody can say they don't have, or they're completely neutral. It's just not true. You have a way that you are perceiving the world.
Yeah, exactly.
So what are some of the major components or the major pillars or foundational things behind a Christian, specifically a Christian worldview?
Well, I would say first and foremost, a Christian worldview is rooted in a biblical worldview.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is everything that the Christian world, if it is Christian, comes forth from a biblical understanding that God, meaning that through the Bible, God has revealed himself to us and given that. And he's spoken to us about himself, about creation, about humanity, purpose, moral order, and behavior, and all the things that encompass our lives. So I would.
Yeah. And I think you have to include in that there's presuppositions that we make that there's a distinction between God and the world. That there is a God would be one presupposition. There's a distinction between God and his world, that God is the creator. Further, that, to echo the Apostle Paul when he speaks on Mars Hill at Athens, of him, through him, and to him are all things. So there's an idea of origins, there's an idea of being, ontology, there's elements of epistemology, how do you know things, and then there's what philosophers call teleology, there's an end in view. The belief that God is both transcendent and immanent, that at one and the same time God is very much present with us, but is far, far above us, and that he's revealed himself. That goes back to echo what you said about Scripture, Jason. We believe that God has revealed himself ultimately in the incarnation, God in the flesh, but he's actually spoken. And while he has not spoken exhaustively of himself, which would be an infinite project, he has spoken truly of himself. And we can actually know about him sufficiently. I think you have to include in that the idea of man in the image of God, created in the image of God. And while sin has entered the world, we still retain elements of that image, and that humans can actually know God. And that revelation from God is both in the natural order and through special revelation, through Christ and through the Scriptures. So I think all of that has to do with a Christian worldview.
Identity, did we talk about how that is part of it as well? Recognizing who we are in relationship to that God, that, as you said, we're not God.
Yeah.
Well, I think you have to have the concept of the relationship to give definition. Far too often, I think Christians lose sight of how important the concept of image of God is, that there's a reason human beings have value, and that there is a distinction between a human being and any other creature in this world, any other being in this world. He did not say of the ape, the dog, the whale, the amoeba, this is in my image. Rather, he said of man, this is my image. And the whole concept, image and likeness, have to do with man in his relationship to God and man in his relationship to the world.
Absolutely. So let's, another nebulous term perhaps that ties in here in some various ways is the idea of culture. What is culture, and how is that distinctive from worldview?
Well, the word culture comes from the Latin word cultura, which is a reference to agriculture. So if you think about plowing, planting, pruning, actually that's not far off. it's what we do with the world around us. Worldview is more a matter of one's individual outlook. Culture is more a relational kind of concept. Andy Crouch, I was reading a book, A Practical Guide to Culture, I've got it in the stacks here, said culture is what human beings make of the world. Mm-hmm. Here's that book, by the way, A Practical Guide to Culture, and that's a helpful volume. It's relationships, it's fashions, it's myths, it's prejudices. All of those things make culture around us. One of the best things I heard, one fellow said, if you want to know about water, don't ask a fish. Okay? Because the fish just is in the water. And that's a little bit what culture is like. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's hard to separate ourselves to even speak to it.
Would you go as far as to say that culture is a corporate worldview? That how the individual's worldview works out with other individuals, that what is kind of the fruit of those interactions and those worldviews, and it's not monolithic, to be sure. Mm-hmm. And there's diversity within it. You know, different worldviews are in a culture there, and each person gives more credibility or more weight to one aspect over another, and some have a better understanding of what is true in the world than others, to be sure. But I wonder if some of the patterns that come out and the practices, the ceremonies, the government, all of the production of a group of people that is, in a sense, that culture, and perhaps that maybe that worldview working together corporately.
I think I hadn't considered it in those terms. I think there's contact points, and I'd have to ponder that a little further. Culture, at times, I think, is very unconscious, subconscious at least, but maybe very unconscious. Think of it this way: in our culture, if you don't have a television, you're weird. Mm-hmm. All right? In fact, the other day I was just pondering the fact that even in my lifetime, how much that has changed. I have more than one television in my house. When I grew up, if you had a television, that was the norm, but you had one. If you had two, that was conspicuous consumption and likely extraordinarily unnecessary. And if you had more than that, you were just showing off. Now it is assumed. If you don't have a smartphone, you're a weirdo.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
I mean, you go down the list of things that are just kind of, and these are shared across worldviews. Mm-hmm. Everybody has at least one vehicle, at least in this part of the world. Now you go to a major city, you have people that are older than I am that never got a driver's license. Mm-hmm. Because the culture in which they find themselves, public transport is just what you do. Why would you bother with a license? Who wants to drive in a major metro? If you can get everywhere you want to go with public transportation, why bother? And I'm picking on some specific things. I'm just saying there's elements of this where it, in a sense, kind of supersedes, and it can reflect but not necessarily worldview. It's just kind of I think the relational cultural assumptions around one another.
And very similar to worldview, though, like you are shaped by it in ways that you don't really
absolutely
realize. It's a lot like the fish analogy, but our culture, you don't realize how much you're affected by it.
So what worldview would you say is dominating our culture? I think it's
hedonism.
Yeah.
It's all about me. I think I'm sure this book will come up, if not tonight, more later on. But Carl Trueman's recent book, "The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self." Did I have that right?
Yes.
It's funny, but we are not funny. It's tragic. I think we are reaping the fruits of the self-esteem movement that I grew up in.
Yes, I would agree.
I think that so much of it that went into it, just that was inculcated in me in school and other things and growing up. And it certainly didn't start there. It's got roots much further back. But this idea that everybody is, should be given the trophies for participating. That there's this idea of no winner or loser. That everybody we're all winners, and and that whatever you think or feel is right. Must be right, and then not only must be right for you, but it must be approved of by everybody else. Seems to be the main thing, and of course, how inconsistent can that be? Because oftentimes the thing that I want and think that's right for myself is not what's going to be right for Lance or what Lance thinks is right, and therein comes a lot of the cultural conflict, I think.
Yeah, it's ultimately disastrous. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing take place to an extent. What happens whenever my view of myself runs into serious conflict with other people's view of themselves? And you move from either, if I can get enough muscle on the part of the government, then I can exercise a certain totalitarian approach that makes you comply, or you have anarchy. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing, a little bit of both at this point. We can't decide what's more important, the one or the many.
Or you have thoughts on social media.
Yeah.
Oh, those are always helpful. Those kinds of discussions.
I'm curious. So I was thinking about this as we were thinking about the different views of worldviews, and I looked up something on Ligonier Ministries, and they kind of listed the different types of worldviews, and obviously postmodernism, the idea, there's no absolute truth, that type of mindset. And I almost wonder if it's like a combination of several worldviews combined. And what I mean by that is, so if you take the postmodernism and then another worldview that they list is moralistic therapeutic deism, which is God just wants us to be happy and nice to other people. He intervenes in our affairs only when we call on him to help us out. And I think that from a cultural standpoint, I don't know what the statistics say, but you get this idea of God just wants us to be happy, right? But yet there's also this idea hanging out there like there is no absolute truth. So I just want you to be happy. I just want you to, and yet, but there's no objective truth whatsoever. And that seems to me, when I look at our culture today, like predominantly, if you take big culture or worldview, I would almost say like there seems to be some mixtures of the worldviews. I don't know if I can say there's one dominant one out there right now, but the idea of self and all that is.
Well, if you look at what we have in essence is the worldview that predominated for decades and decades, centuries one could say, is modernism. Modernism is the idea of progress. We have the ability to understand our world, to shape our world, that we can live better through invention and discovery, make the world a better place. It was, in essence, a very progressive idea. Now, that prevailed, basically you call it the Enlightenment project, from, say, the 1500s forward, some version of that. It really takes off, grows, I should say, in American culture from the middle 1800s after the Civil War forward. And then 2 world wars, and a Korean War, and a Vietnam War, and multiple political scandals, the rise and fall of communism. And all of that together really caused modernism to take some hits over whether or not it could deliver what it promised. It created a skepticism that the answers were found in science. So postmodernism comes along. And postmodernism is the idea that this is too barren, too cold, and science isn't the only answer. In fact, it's not even an answer per se. Postmodernism comes along and tries to include spirituality, but further says that we've just kind of been lying to each other. because words are very fluid, and what they mean is very fluid. And the idea that was big within postmodernism was called deconstruction, where you look at texts, especially literature would be a place, and you tried to deconstruct it. That the intent of the author has no place here, because without the author present, we don't know what his intention was. And this kind of a postmodern critique of literature, of science, of history, certainly of theology, of all of these things, what it ultimately ends up with is a shrug. We just don't know. And it was kind of a wink and a nod that, you know, it might mean something, it might not. And so it became very fractured. It helps create a fracturing, I think, in the society and culture.
It started as a sort of benign agnosticism, I think, this idea that we can't be sure of much of anything, to the point now where to presume to know something is, it's gone from benign to aggressive and on the offensive side of attacking those who would have presumed to have any kind of certainty.
I went to art school, and so, you do a piece of art, and it's like, what does that mean? And you could say, well, what does it mean to you?
Yeah.
It's kind of
Yeah.
great, because as the artist, I didn't have to answer any questions.
Right.
Yeah.
I could just do it.
Well, in fact, in a sense, it's meaningless for you to impart that, because then you're pushing on to others that they might have another and better interpretation.
And you've seen, like, postmodernism, some of these worldviews really even infiltrate the church.
Yes.
And have really extreme damaging effects amongst leadership. And so that's why this whole discussion on worldview is important.
So, Jason, you were talking about how postmodernism has crept into the church. Can you give us an example of that?
Well, I think of people like Rob Bell that remember years ago, Joshua Harris recently, and their views of the authority of Scripture and how they've just completely walked away from the faith. Yeah. And these were, even in Joshua Harris in Reform circles, was a pretty prominent teacher to many people that a lot of people looked up to and for encouragement and teaching on the Scriptures. And he got sucked in to that worldview and that type of mindset, and it had damaging effects, and a lot of people were hurt because of that. And so,
yeah, postmodernism by its very nature is skepticism. You could almost say skepticism on steroids, and it influences in so many ways. And then, not even recognizing, we were joking about it a bit ago, that I've often said that I think postmodernism may well have begun in a Southern Baptist rural church in southwest Missouri in a Sunday school class, whenever they said, the teacher didn't come prepared, and they read a text and went around the room of the 12 people there and said, so what did you think that meant? What do you think that meant? And they came up with 12 different answers. And when it was all said and done, they said, isn't that wonderful? The Bible can mean anything to any one of us. Well, that's basically postmodern interpretation. We never consider what the author meant. It's what does it mean to me? Well, once you start down that path, there is no objectivity. There's no way to speak authoritatively. And folks are somewhat offended when you say, you know what, I really don't much care what it means to you. What it matters is what it means.
Yeah.
And that's actually something that can be seen and learned and understood, unless you're going, again, if you jettison the idea of objectivity of any kind and communication, you're doomed.
So where do you think we are now compared to, say, 20 years ago?
Oh my, I think we're in a much worse place, where we have stepped into, I would say we're beginning to come full circle in the ideas of postmodernism. And as we talk here in a little bit more about critical theory, we just have a culture and people within the culture that are just absolutely devoid of any anchors at all. There is nothing to hold on to. Everything is in flux.
Yeah.
And the rise of the modern self. We have this noble idea, well, if I'll just look inside, I can find the answers in me. Such a lie. Because what happens when my answers make my wife's life miserable? What happens when the answers I think I have impose on somebody else in some fashion? What happens when my answers then basically give me the excuse to abandon all of my commitments and responsibilities? This is what we're living. This is what we're watching happen as a culture.
Yeah.
Didn't you have, and I'm going to kind of put you on the spot here, sorry, but you quoted, I think it may have been Moeller, that he had something about talking about the inward.
Right. Well, Moeller said that the world's understanding, current culture understanding is this: all my problems are external, and the answers are internal. If I just tap into my inner answers, I can deal with the problems around me. While a Christian worldview says, my problems are internal. Not saying there aren't problems around me, but my biggest problems are internal, and the answer is external in Christ and what He has done.
Yeah.
I think recently, Doug, it was really helpful you said this, and I can't remember if it was in one of our conversations here or somewhere else we were talking about just the way that our culture has been going generationally, how, whether or not that our country was founded on truly Christian principles is debated, but there was at least a deistic foundation, and there was arguably a Christian morality.
Yes.
And so these two things were very much the foundational elements of American culture, and eventually what happened is any semblance of Christian worldview has kind of eroded away, and then you had merely the Christian morality, and over the last I don't know how many years, without the Christian gospel foundation to hold up that Christian morality, even the Christian morality, the Judeo-Christian worldview, or ethics and values and things have begun to crumble, and now our culture is trying to put something under some kind of new moorings underneath to hold up some kind of moral structure, and it just doesn't bear weight.
Right. Well, and I'd say even further, I don't even think there's an attempt to put anything under it to hold it. I think there's been a rejection of the whole concept. What the external idea of a morality and ethic and understanding moving you is passé culturally. It's totally internalized. It's all about the self. It is no longer that I see me in a social relationship or in a relationship to a transcendent or external morality, religion, ethic, anything. I'm creating it myself. And because of that, there is nothing to hold the culture together any longer. Whenever you took the heart of Christianity out, the reality of Christ, the cross, the gospel, the necessity of conversion, and tried to hold on to the Christian ethic and morality, it lasted for some generations. But eventually a generation comes along that says, why? Why does this matter? When you've rejected supernaturalism, when you've thrown the Scripture away, you've thrown Jesus as God in the flesh away, in essence thrown God away, and you've tried to hold on to the morality, then there is nothing to hold it up. And the first time folks start hammering on it, well, why do that? We don't believe in that God anymore. Why does this matter? Well, and we're living.
It's a true slippery slope.
It is. It's created the crumbling and destruction that we're seeing around us now.
And yet people are still, the inconsistencies, people are still saying, well, you ought to do something. You ought to behave in a certain way. You ought to respect my boundaries. But what are these oughts based on?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and respect, that's one of the things that's so intriguing. People no longer think in terms of honor or right, wrong. They think in terms of respect. How dare you disrespect me? I can't tell you how many times in the last 20 years you hear that phrasing. You're disrespecting me. Well, what I may be doing is disagreeing with you respectfully. But the fact that I'm disagreeing with you becomes an attack on their self. And thus I am disrespecting you by not affirming you.
Which goes back to the worldview question.
It goes back to a worldview question. Can we, the old liberal idea, to use a term that's been poorly handled, the old liberal concept was this: I may disagree with you vehemently, Lance, and think that you're absolutely Looney Tunes to think what you think. But the old American concept was, and anchored in a Judeo-Christian ethic, was this: I'll fight to the death for you to believe something that I think's wrong, because I believe in freedom of conscience. And I'm also comfortable enough to believe that at some point truth may well triumph in your life. And I'd make allowance for that. But we have lost that. In fact, Francis Schaeffer, and I would encourage folks to read Francis Schaeffer, although it's a little dated. His works, The God Who Is There, Escape from Reason, that's a little one, and then He Is There and He Is Not Silent, are all very helpful in getting a handle on how we've arrived at this place in history.
I would also throw in there probably C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity.
Yes.
Speaks to that.
He does.
Well.
And Lewis especially talks about that thing of ought.
Yes.
And I've shared this before, but I found the quote. This is 1974. Schaeffer made this statement: as I've stressed over and over again, I do not believe for a moment that if men back at the point of history, and he's talking about Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, scientists of a bygone era, had the philosophy, the epistemology is how you know things, of modern man, I don't think there would ever have been modern science. I think, and this is what he said in 1974, I think science is going to die too. I think its death is coming. I think it's going to be reduced to two things: mere technology and a form of sociological manipulation.
If that wasn't prophetic.
And you think about that. Here's a fellow, what is that, 46 years now ago? 47 years? He's already seeing, because he was seeing, and what's funny to me is I read Schaeffer in the 80s. Just shifted my world. It was dramatic what it did for me. But I didn't comprehend. He was basically talking about what today we call postmodernism. But he was seeing it there because he was recognizing the movement of history in thought. And I'm sitting here thinking, technology. We live for tech, and tech defines us. And sociology. It doesn't matter that science says you have an XY chromosome. Therefore, you are born a male. I've seen too much news lately where physicians and hospitals, if you say you're female, what they write on your chart is female. Doesn't matter what science says. What matters is how I feel about things.
And it's only given any credibility if it supports my preconceived notion.
Precisely. Yeah.
So that leads us into much of the current worldview today, which has been given the name critical theory. Let's unpack that a bit. And obviously, there are whole doctoral degrees devoted to understanding critical theory, and there have been people much smarter than I am, and perhaps smarter than all of us, I would dare say, who are writing and discussing and talking about these things. But let's as best we can, try to put the cookies on the bottom shelf here. What do we mean when we use the words critical theory? And what are some of the other categories and associated terms and phrases?
I'll let you go.
All right. Put it as simplistically as you can. And this, I'll admit, is simplistic. And you critics out there, keep in mind, I warned you, this is simplistic. It is, in essence, a joining of Marxist political theory and postmodern philosophy. Marxism underwent something of a tragedy, if you will, that they didn't know what to do. It didn't work out. And Marxism, of course, operates under the idea, the classic Marxism, is the world is defined economically. Mm-hmm. There are those who have wealth and those who don't. Workers and the proletariat. And the day is going to come when the workers eventually throw off the shackles of their betters, their oppressors, and make it on their own. And you'll have eventually a socialist system and eventually a communist system. Everybody has exactly what they need. Well, the experiments with that have all turned out badly. And there was also this thing of, why is it that people aren't running to this? So the idea came that maybe we need to frame Marxism in a different way. Rather than the worker and the bourgeois wealthy, the oppressed victim and the oppressor. And that's how you interpret history, and that's how you interpret the world. Well, you couple that then with an aspect of postmodernism in its deconstruction, destroying what words mean, saying that words are power, and whoever frames the narrative is the one who defines what the world looks like. And the victors, or in this case the oppressors, are the ones writing the history. Mm-hmm. And so the oppressors use language to subject the victims, and the victims try to work within the language of the oppressor and fail and never get out from under the oppression. So that is the short version. Now, there's more to it. Erich Fromm, Wilhelm Reich, Herbert Marcuse. You can go back to Frankfurt School in the 1930s. There have been others written recently, but critical theory then has morphed into what we see today as critical race theory, queer theory, post-colonial theory. All of those, including the issues most often associated with social justice, are all anchored in critical theory.
What about critical theory, and again, we don't want to just, as we're getting into this, I don't want us to just set up a straw man so that we can knock down. But what are some positive sentiments behind critical theory? Would you say are there noble intentions behind it? Do you think?
When I've heard people talk about it, I think good points are made that there are people that are oppressed. There are victims. There is injustice. There are oppressors. So I think at least what you have to do is affirm that there are truths there that are trying to be recognized and dealt with.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. I think there are elements of it where my assessment at the moment would be to say, I think there are times when it is extraordinarily accurate descriptively. Mm. It looks at things and says, here is something that can be described. Now, where I think it makes horrible mistakes is prescriptively. Mm-hmm. What do you do to resolve the problems? I think it makes some valid points about issues of race. I think there are elements of it that might make us think in ways that would be helpful to ponder what it is like for African Americans and other people groups in the United States. I think there's elements of it that help understand a little more of what it can be like to grow up out of favor, if you will, with the culture around you. Mm-hmm. So we ought to be careful. I think there's, I think it inadequate to do oppressor and oppressed as the best way to describe the world. But I think there are elements of it where we ought to recognize some of this to me sounds like a shout at this point, almost a scream of frustration. Something needs to change.
And I think you're right. I think there are folks who embrace critical theory not because it's a cohesive, cogent worldview, but because in their mind they don't see any other way. They don't have other tools and to address the issues and the wrongs that they see about them.
Yes.
And they don't have. They're looking for something, and this is being given to them.
Yeah. Well, when you had the wedding of Marxism and postmodernism was just kind of an attitude. Ironic, kind of like, hell, how do we ever talk? And it had no action to it. In fact, it had the seeds of its own demise in that if you're going to deconstruct, then you end up deconstructing the deconstruction.
Yeah.
But when you wed that kind of view of power with this modified Marxism, suddenly you do have activism. You have something to do. We need to help the oppressed throw off the oppressor. Mm-hmm. How do we go about doing that?
And the assumption is there can be no. It's a zero-sum game. In order for me to have what I need, I must take it from those who would withhold it from me. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There is no there must be conflict. I must because my life isn't fulfilled, because I don't have all of the wealth or the resources or the career or the things that I think I ought to have. Right. Somebody is withholding it from me.
Mm-hmm. Well, and issues of justice.
Yeah.
I mean, we have seen some horrible things. And I'm not going to comment on specifics because many of them are in litigation. And we don't know what all is going on. And I would caution believers, be careful about making assessments about things you see in video. We weren't there, none of us. And the very presence of media, even if the media is an individual recording, has an impact on how you see something. That's unavoidable. We should wait until the information fully comes forward before we make assessments. Yeah. But that said, it is tragic that the percentages of black Americans who are in prison versus total population, the deaths, the tragedy in the families, all of that is something we should not be ignoring.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we need better tools to address it.
And I don't think that. I think that critical race theory as the tool to address that is a horrible tool. And one of the reason is because like you guys have commented, it does set it up that our problem, that the whole issue is that you have oppressor and oppressed, and you have those who are in power and who don't. Mm-hmm. Right, and that the main objective is to make it equitable across the board, but it completely ignores man's sin against a holy God. Yeah. That the true problem of humanity is that, and it's not the structure of oppress versus oppressor, and I think because what they do is they construct that the whole worldview kind of hinges on that premise.
Oh, there's no question that is essential in any aspect of critical theory. And of course, the other thing that happens is you can't really, we've already crossed a line by having a critique of critical theory. Because the idea is we are part of the oppressors. Mm-hmm. We have helped set the narrative or bought the narrative. And any criticism we render is automatically inappropriate and moot.
Yeah.
Because all we're arguing for is to keep our power. Well, if you don't have a way to critique your own understanding.
And I've seen in articles and those that advocate for CT and CRT and some of these related things, when those who they presume to be the oppressed don't articulate their oppression, then clearly their oppression is so bad they're even unaware of it.
Yes.
It's just, it must be true. It's self-verifying. And there's no as you said, there's no way to criticize it because to criticize it is to be part of the problem.
And it has gotten to the point where CRT, for example, it's starting to get into the realm of, like you were talking, literature.
Oh, yeah.
And we can't read a commentary on Scripture and claim that has any validity or truth in it because of the color of someone's skin who did the interpretation.
Right.
And did the study of that. And
there's your worldview coming into play, impacting.
Exactly.
So this is clearly deep water here, and Doug, I appreciate the amount of study that you've put into it. I don't know if it's been clear to our audience, but you've carried us this evening, and we are grateful for your wisdom. Let's begin to kind of bring things to a head for tonight, and we'll discuss more next week. But how do we compare this with a Christian worldview or a biblical worldview? Let's explicitly lay out the differences.
I think to compare is pretty straightforward. I mean, I think each view strives for justice, strives for inequality. So I think the intention is good. Justice from the Christian worldview probably looks a little bit different because it's an eternal mindset. It is seeing the resolution is ultimately peace with God that creates peace with each other, and so that's primary. But I think you could at least say that they both seek justice.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So how would you distinguish them?
Well, I think it gets it wrong on a whole host of issues, and there's major differences. Like just the way that you view the lens of the world versus oppressed versus oppressor, instead of viewing that, hey, all of us apart from the grace of God or like all of us are fallen. The idea of total depravity. I don't know if they would ascribe to that. The idea of the family and the role of the family that we see in Scripture, they wouldn't agree to that. So there's really, I think there's a lot of, like, for example, because one of the issues that critical theory or critical race theory and intersectionality all define is they define one of the problems I see is they define who are the oppressed groups, right? Mm-hmm. And they consider, like, okay, an oppressed group is, for example, someone in the LGBTQ. Hold on, let me get it right. LGBTQ. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, there's a plus movement. So they would look at them and they would say, okay, they're an oppressed people group. I would agree that that there is some things that have been done to that community that are wicked and wrong and things of that nature. But what they would say is part of that oppression is for you to not agree that their choice in sexuality is not a good thing. If you were to say that it is not a good thing, right, then therefore you are being an oppressor to them. Yeah. And then that's where I would find disagreement with that type of theory.
Well, the essence of it is this: they're both, and I know some could push back on this, but I think it's inescapable. These are religious views. Ultimately, they are worldviews of a virtually religious nature. Both have views of origins. Now, critical theory is going to be anchored in an evolutionary view, materialistic worldview. Christianity begins with a creator. They both have views of sin. Mm-hmm. While we would view sin as first a violation, offense to God, and then later to one another, it begins with a social dimension, and only the social dimension. And even then, a very specific, narrowed understanding of that social dimension.
They would see themselves primarily as having been sinned against.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
they're very specific in the way the sin is. There are only certain groups who have been sinned against and only certain groups who have sinned.
Right.
The view of salvation is remarkably different. Further, the eschatology, the outcomes, is remarkably different. Critical theory, by its very nature, is anchored in a view that there is no God above, in essence, to answer to, or if so, he's so very much removed. And so, I think what Christians ought to hear is the agony, the pain in a lot of this. What we must never do is surrender a biblical understanding of the causes of those pain.
Yes.
And while at the same time thinking maybe we do need to consider what are ways that could be just and righteous to be helpful to folks who are oppressed.
Yeah.
There are things that, I grew up in one of the whitest small towns in the world. So there are things that I admit readily, I don't understand. We ought to have empathy, and I think that gets lost sometimes. There's the danger that we won't empathize, that we just, get our necks stiff and no, this is just wrong. And we ought to have empathy, but empathy should never lead to the destruction of principle or abandoning truth.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of danger involved in drinking too deep from the stream of CT. And I think you just got to be so very, very careful with this thing because it is a totalizing worldview.
Yeah.
Yeah. So who are some individuals, some authors, some books that have helped you guys, maybe in your own personal formation?
I would say if you have the availability every morning throughout the week for 30 minutes, it's like 23 minutes almost every morning, listen to Albert Mohler's podcast.
The Briefing.
And The Briefing.
Yes.
And what he does is he goes through current events and interprets them from a Christian worldview. And it is absolutely fantastic.
It is.
And it's well worth the time every morning to do that. So.
I usually listen to it on my commute into the office most days.
Yeah.
My commute's short, but I do try to listen to it often. But I concur that basically Mohler has been really helpful for me to view a lot of these issues.
He's got a little book called Culture Shift that is very helpful on the issues. I mentioned Francis Schaeffer, one other book of his, A Christian Manifesto. It came out, I think, in 1980, but it is very helpful in understanding some of what we're dealing with. A Lutheran author, Jean Edward Veith, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, Veith, Loving God with All Your Mind. Anything by this lad is going to be thoughtful and helpful. He did another one called Postmodern Times, A Christian Guide to Contemporary Thought and Culture. Doug Groothuis, Truth Decay, Defending Christianity Against the Challenges of Postmodernism. D.A. Carson's The Intolerance of Tolerance is helpful. Os Guinness he did one years ago called Fit Bodies, Fat Minds. That's helpful. He also did one called Fool's Talk, Recovering the Art of Christian Persuasion. This one by John Stonestreet and Brett Kunkel, A Practical Guide to Culture, is a helpful read. On the issues of sexuality, it is hard to beat Rosaria Butterfield's Secret Thoughts of an Unlikely Convert. And if you can find anything of Rosaria's, they're out there on YouTube. You can hear lectures. She is brilliant, as is Nancy Piercy, Love Thy Body, answering hard questions about life and sexuality. There's another one I didn't bring. I'll bring it next week. You mentioned earlier Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. I'm about a fourth of the way through it, but it is extraordinarily helpful in understanding what's going on around us. Those are the ones I'd recommend anyway.
That's a good list. I would add C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity and some of his other essays have been helpful to me.
Yeah.
There was another person I was going to mention. R.C. Sproul's done some things that have been.
Yes.
He's done something on some things on philosophy and worldview that have been helpful. You can find some of those videos even.
Yes.
And you're not going to go wrong with R.C. Sproul unless you're talking ecclesiology.
Yes, precisely.
Or baptism.
Yeah.
But his stuff on worldview is excellent.
Brilliant.
Well, guys, that's all the time we have for this week. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for watching, and we hope to be back with you next time. We'll dive a little bit deeper into this as it applies to critical race theory. What does it have to say about racial tensions, and how do we as Christians address some of these things from the Christian worldview? We hope you'll join us then. Goodbye.